together right now.
Ivor Davis, welcome to Come Together with the Beatles.
Delighted to be in lovely Malibu.
Welcome to the Beatles Come to America, doing a little house cleaning in his show, Coming Together with the Beatles show. The Beatle guru, Brooke Halpin, and he had an interview, and he wants to dig out his vault and talk about it. How are you today?
I'm fantastic, Tom. How you doing?
Let me tell you. I don't know about you, but this summer has been really super hot.
Yeah, for sure.
There are like housework, yard work. It's all on the back burner waiting for September. I know that this is the 60th anniversary for the Beatles. So you are super busy this year, like one red carpet after another.
Yeah, things have been very exciting. And the thing about this particular show that I did with Ivor Davis is we are celebrating in Ivor's honor the 60th anniversary of when he was asked to join the Beatles on their first U.S. and Canadian tour in August 19th, 1964. So we thought, why not do the 60th anniversary of Ivor and the interview that I did with him when he was actually touring with the Beatles as a journalist and a writer 60 years ago, August 19th, 1964.
How cool was that? Yeah, what a gift. And also, he was the ghostwriter for George's column during that year.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
So he has put a lot of gear and fab in there in his comments.
Yeah, he was writing the column for George. That was part of his mission on the tour. And Ivor told me, and you'll probably hear this in the show, but I'll say it anyway. He went up to George early on in the tour. And of course, Ivor was writing the column and sending it to London, right? And so then Ivor showed it to George. And George said, "Oh, this is a bunch of shite." And shite is a polite word or an English way of saying shit, So, and Ivor was like, "Well, you're not giving me anything. I'm creating all this stuff." And so anyhow, they kind of worked things out as the tour continued, but don't really know how much, if anything, George contributed to his quote unquote columns, because Ivor was obviously the writer and George was the Beatle.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we're going to release this show on the 19th. We're recording this in advance. This is a celebration year. We already finished the Beatles Come to America. It's already in the can. And what that means is if you haven't, listened to us before, we're really concerned why, because it's a really good show. We reviewed all the U.S. albums in order. They're done already. We started 2018, 2019, and then it got released during the pandemic. So it's out there already. So we love working together. We're celebrating the 60th year of the Beatles. We've came back together to talk about the releases for this year. Brooke has this one in the can, and it's very timely. Awesome. So we're going to finish up this conversation. I'm going to suggest that you go back and listen to our stuff. We have the whole thing ready for you. So you can binge listen at your leisure. Brooke, is there anything you want to say before we start the show?
Well, I want to thank Ivor for doing the interview with me. He did it, I want to say, back in 2016 is when we did it. His publicist contacted me because his book had just been released, The Beatles and Me on Tour, which is all about him touring with the Beatles in 1964. And actually, he also toured with them in 1965. So I just want to give a big thank you to Ivor. He's really a great guy. He's a mate of mine. We're friends. I've done some performances with him, actually, since 2016. And so, yeah, there's a wealth of information that people don't know about. I mean, when they hear this interview with Ivor, they're going to be going, wow, I never knew that. Absolutely very revealing stuff.
Or I should say, we're here exclusively today to talk about you and your book, The Beatles and Me on tour. And this is about you with the Beatles on their North American tour in 1964.
When most of your listeners were probably not even born.
Well, some of them probably not, but some of them, yes. And I'm sure that had to be one amazing whirlwind of an experience. So can you tell us a little bit how it happened?
Well, I was very lucky in the right place at the right time. I was a foreign correspondent for the London Daily Express, a very large newspaper with 4 million readers in the days when people actually read newspapers. Mm-hmm. And my editor called me from London. I was in Hollywood. He said, the Beatles are coming to San Francisco. Get on the plane, join them, travel with them, eat with them, sleep with them, and also write a column for George Harrison for our newspaper. So off I went, and believe me, I must tell you this, I never expected what I saw and what happened.
That must have been so overwhelming when you got that call. That was from David English, is that correct?
Yes. David English sent me out, and to be honest with you, communications back in their days were not as brilliant as they are today. We didn't have the internet. And so you learned things by radio. I'd seen the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, as did 74 million people. And I knew they were a singing group, but I didn't know that much more, and they came from a town called Liverpool. And so off I went to San Francisco on what I say was obviously a ticket to ride that was unbelievable.
The tour started in San Francisco. On August 19th, 1964, the Beatles played at the Cow Palace. In your book, it states there were about 17,000 people attending that concert. Was it in San Francisco that they wanted to have a ticker tape parade for the Beatles?
That's correct. The original, because the reception earlier had been so phenomenal when they came to do the Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, someone suggested a ticker tape parade for when they arrived in San Francisco to kick the whole thing off. Brian Epstein, who was the guy, of course, that turned them from the Greasy Kids into the Beatles we love, said he doesn't want the boys to do that because look what happened. He didn't actually say that to local authorities, but he told us, look what happened when John Kennedy did an open. That was a wound. The death of John Kennedy in November 1963 was still fresh and raw in everybody's mind. So Brian said, no, thank you.
And Brian, I'm sure, must have protected the Beatles just like they were his children.
Exactly. In fact, they were his children. They were his life. They were the thing for Brian. Brian's modus operandi was the Beatles. He fell in love with them all when he first saw them at the Cavern in Liverpool. And he was their father, their confessor, and the guy who turned them, as I said, from the Greasy Kids into the clean-cut mop tops.
And Brian was especially fond of John, I understand.
He was. He was fond of John. There were stories, as I'm sure those Beatle aficionados know, that Brian was in love with John, took him off to Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And the remarkable element of that is that he took him off to Spain shortly after
Julian was born.
Exactly. Which is, devoted dads don't usually leave their newborns, or maybe in those days you did.
Well, Cynthia was quite upset when that happened, naturally.
Yes.
But John being John, John had to do what he had to do, and nothing would stop John.
Exactly. John had a sort of a slightly manipulative part of his brain that said, if I am the closest Beatle to Brian, then I can run the show. And that probably went through his mind. I'm sure it did.
Tell me, that was the first time you saw the Beatles perform live at the Cow Palace, is that right?
It was right. It was correct, yes.
Okay.
I walked into this incredible cavernous place that they had. They used to have cattle shows and stuff like that. And there were screaming girls, thousands of them. And I mean, I'd never seen it before in my life. In fact, I'd never really been to a rock and roll concert with anything like what I was confronted with at the Cow Palace. And the terrible thing was that the music began when the Beatles began, and I could never hear a single word because every single girl screamed non-stop from start to finish.
So you couldn't hear the music then?
You couldn't hear the music, and it went on like that for about the next 34 days. Every single concert. I jokingly say I don't know what the songs were about, and the Beatles sometimes couldn't hear themselves. And in fact, Ringo said he lost his way many a time. He didn't know what they were singing, and then he learned to do a little bit of lip reading. and he managed to catch up with what they were singing. So it was noisy.
Now, where were you in the Cow Palace? Were you backstage?
Front row seat. Front row seat at the side, so that I was told, as soon as they start singing Long Tall Sally, you get out of here, into the second limo, which I travelled in. And then as soon as Long Tall Sally, which was the last song in there.
That was always their closing number.
And as soon as that was over, the Beatles were guitars down, off the stage, no encores, in the limo, in the meat truck, in the armoured car. We were out of there.
And then Mal picked up all the instruments later,
Mal
right?
cleaned it up. Mal Evans, yeah.
Mal Evans.
Yeah.
Very interesting note I saw in your book, by the way, which I love.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for writing that book.
Thank you.
When they played in Las Vegas that same year, just a short time afterward, Liberace insisted that he meet the Beatles because he loved the way the Beatles played the piano. Now, wait a minute, Ivor.
Yeah.
You and I know the way that Liberace played the piano. He was extremely flamboyant, not only in his playing, but in his designing and his fashion and everything, and the way he dressed. But he played much more classically. He never played anything like pop or rock songs or like rock and roll music by Chuck Berry. So what was he talking about that he loves the way the Beatles played the piano?
Well, I think he was being a little bit humorous, if you like. A little bit of Liberace humor, because he was over the top, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He was excessive in everything he did.
That's right.
And so he was pulling their legs, and they wanted to see Liberace. They expected this flamboyant guy to wander in. But this guy who John said looked like a dweeb came in. and they thought, is this the guy we've seen on television? Is this the Mr. Flamboyant piano player?
So the Beatles were disappointed.
Very disappointed.
Liberace.
Oh, terrible disappointment.
But I'm sure Liberace was not disappointed meeting the Beatles.
I don't think so. I mean, I think he loved to see the noise, the action. And the Beatles weren't too wildly flamboyant. But somehow, Liberace, I know, enjoyed their music. And there was Pat Boone there, who was also slightly different to Liberace and slightly different to the Beatles. And he was there that night at the Las Vegas Convention Center to see the Beatles.
So Pat Boone was there too?
Yes.
With his saddle shoes, his white saddle shoes?
Indeed.
White bucks. Maybe they were the white bucks he was wearing back then. Now, another interesting note. Then they come to Hollywood, and they're playing at the Hollywood Bowl on August 23rd. And Brian wanted to book them into the Ambassador Hotel, but the Ambassador turned them down. Why did the Ambassador Hotel turn the Beatles down?
Well, it's an interesting question. It would have been good PR to have them.
You would think so.
But they realized that based on other experiences of other large hotels in other cities, bedlam would reign the moment the Beatles rolled into their hotel. And they had other guests. I don't think they thought ahead. They didn't think to say, wow, we can promote the fact that the Beatles slept here. Because in other hotels, they promoted that. And when the Beatles left, people sold bed sheets and towels and pieces of soap allegedly used by the Beatles. The ambassador wanted decorum. And they said, no, thank you. We can't accommodate you. And so the Beatles ended up renting a private abode.
A private home up in Bel Air.
Yes.
I guess the Ambassador folks didn't see the upside to the Beatles staying there.
That's the perfect way of putting it. Upside they did not realize.
Now, it seems to me that on this tour in August to September 1964, that the one city that had the biggest attendance for one single concert was Jacksonville, Florida, with 23,000 people attending that one. Was it because of the size of the arena that allowed it, or was it had to do with the local promotions that were going on prior to the Beatles arriving?
Well, what happened was first of all, there was a problem with hurricane weather. And so the hurricane had led to a little bit of early promotion saying the Beatles are coming. But the simple answer, I think, to be honest with you, Brooke, is that it was the biggest venue. The biggest venue they played until the following year, you know, which was the great Shea Stadium.
The Shea Stadium,
55,000.
Right.
But the Beatles never played to such ginormous stadiums. They played in fairly large stadiums in America, but in Europe, not as big.
So then that was probably their biggest attendance prior to Shea would be the Jacksonville concert.
Yes, and the Hollywood Bowl, I think, also packed in 17,000, so it was fairly close.
Now, here's another interesting story in your book. By the way, again, I have to say I love The Beatles and Me on Tour by Ivor Davis. Charles O. Finley. Now, here's a very interesting character from Kansas City. And I love the way you tell the story, that he told the people in Kansas City, I'm going to bring you the Beatles. And Brian's like, oh, well, we can't squeeze you in. We're already overbooked. The lads need some time off. So Mr. Finley writes out a check for $50,000. And Brian goes, gee, I'm terribly sorry, but we can't do it. Charles rips up the check, writes a check for $100,000. Now, mind you, this is 1964. $100,000 in 1964 is a lot of bloody money.
Indeed.
So he goes back to Brian. Well, how about this, Mr. Epstein? I'm quite sorry, Charles, but we can't fill you in. He rips up the check and he writes another check, the third check. Now, $150,000. Brian raises his eyebrows on $150,000. Oh, let me check with the band. I'll be right back. And then John says, oh, Brian, just do whatever you want to do. Yes. Or something to that effect.
Amazing, isn't it?
Is that the story?
It's a story because they were playing cards. I mean, they didn't appreciate at that time what 150 meant as opposed to 15. They weren't heavily, I know it's hard to imagine, they weren't heavily into the financial picture. They realized that Brian would look after them financially because that's why they went to Brian in the first place. They thought he would be good. He was good with money. And to be honest with you, Paul McCartney said Brian is a Jewish businessman and Jews are good with money. So that's why they took Brian. When the Mr. Kansas City gave them those big bucks, they said, okay, we'll do it. No big decision, no chewing things over and gnashing their teeth. They took it and they did that one extra concert for that money. And Kansas City felt, they said, he promoted it. Mr. Finlay said, the Beatles fans of today are the fans of our baseball team tomorrow.
So he was exploiting it for his own interests.
He was. And then he said he would give some money to the local children's hospital if they came and sold a certain number of tickets. And that's how he managed to snare them when they had a timetable that was jam-packed.
And he wore a Beatle wig when he met them at the airport?
He did. He was a character. He was a sports owner with a personality and an ego to match.
So the gentleman who put the tour together is someone from New York by the name of Norman Weiss, is that right?
Yes. The interesting thing was that Brian left it to the agency in New York to put the tour together. Brian did not have a clue about what the distance was from LA to Seattle, Seattle to Canada. So if you look at the pattern of the first American tour in 1964, you'll see it's kind of insane. They backtrack on each other. Nobody actually knows in the Beatle group where they are. I can tell you that we didn't know where we were landing.
Now, why the hell did that happen? You would think that Norman would know. He lives here in the States. He knows the geography.
But I think he was just trying to pack as much into it. Now, if anybody had the geography of America at their kneecap, they would have said, hey, well, why are we going, where are we backtracking? Why are we going from here to there? It makes more sense to do it better. But the Beatles, I can tell you, didn't know. Whenever we landed in the private jet, we didn't know where we were. And in Canada, I remember this vividly because we knew we were in a foreign country. Because when we landed in Canada, the customs guys came on and they demanded Beatle autographs. And then they demanded their passports.
I see, but autographs first.
Yes, and they knew their priorities. And that was the funny thing. And then when we landed in Toronto, we went straight to a press conference, and the Beatles had been in Toronto for 30 minutes. The Toronto press was saying, John, what do you think of our Canadian ladies? And John said, oh, we're in Canada, are we? Give us time. It was bedlam, it was crazy, and it was all over the place, but it worked.
Well, maybe perhaps part of the reason why they had to go from one city to another city, which didn't make any sense, had to do with the availability of the venues.
Exactly. I mean, the New York agency that put it together, they were the expert. But Brian left it into their capable or incapable hands, and this is what they served up. Brian didn't sit down afterwards and say, no, why should we go to Toronto, come back, and then go back to Canada or go to New York?
He didn't question it.
No, he didn't question it. He just left it to the experts.
Now, what I'd like to know, Ivor, from you, is if you could please tell me what each Beatle was like in private, off the stage. What is your impression of each Beatle?
Well, I must say right away that John was the wizard. John was brilliant. He had a warped sense of humor. When he met me, he said, I said, I'm Ivor. He said, you're Ivan the Terrible. I said, no, it's not Ivan, it's Ivor. I was very serious. I didn't know him. I wasn't going to josh him back. He said, Ivan the Terrible. So I was stuck with Ivan the Terrible as far as John was concerned. But John was the guy who was the most fun to be with. We hung out in his room. We played Monopoly in the middle of the night. John cheated in Monopoly, by the way. I think I mentioned it in the book. Yeah, he was a bit of a cheat. He rolled the dice until he landed on the property he wanted. He kept rolling. That was John. And as you know, John spoke his mind.
Yeah.
And he was politically aware. Mm-hmm. And he spoke his mind. He shot from the hip and sometimes hit himself on the big toe. He did it with the quote about Jesus.
Oh, Lord, yeah.
Which came back to haunt him. Okay, in England, that was okay. But when it came to America, it upset a lot of people in the Bible Belt.
It was a huge mess. And poor Brian. Brian must have been mortified.
He was mortified.
When that happened.
When that happened, the Beatles knew the atmosphere in America in 1966 was not good for the Beatles, particularly John. And somebody suggested to Brian, let's cancel 66.
That's right. I think it was Nat Weiss. It may have been Nat.
Because of the bad odor.
And I recall Brian asking Nat, what would it cost to cancel the tour? Nat says, $1 million. Brian says, fine. So Brian was willing to write a check for $1 million to cancel the tour to protect his boys, to protect the Beatles. But I guess maybe in speaking with the Beatles, they decided, well, you know what? Let's go ahead and do the tour anyway.
Yeah, let's not be. Well, it was ambivalence. Let's not be intimidated by these people who are burning or going to burn, who are going to badmouth the Beatles and say we don't want them in our country. We'd done very well in 64 and 65. But I must tell you, this was the final straw. This event, this badness, this bad attitude towards the Beatles in 1966 was the final straw that broke the camel's back, stopped the Beatles touring. After 1966, they never did another public tour,
Absolutely.
A public concert.
Yeah. Well, the combination of the banning of the Beatles in the Bible Belt, what happened in the Philippines at the same year. It was the same year. So you put all those things together. They can't hear themselves on stage anymore. They don't enjoy playing anymore. Yeah. There's death threats going on. That's it. I'm done touring. I heard that George Harrison said at the end of the concert in San Francisco in 1966, George said something to the effect, I'm no longer a Beatle.
Yes, because he'd had enough. And the point you made a moment ago, Brooke, is that the Beatles realized that people came to see them just to see them. They didn't really appreciate their music, and the Beatles wanted to be appreciated for their music. And so they didn't want to be a circus act. They wanted to be musicians. And of course, they went back into the studio, as you know so well, and turned out some pretty good work.
So they went from performing on stage to creating magic in the recording studio.
Exactly.
Now, Ivor, in your book, you say that Derek Taylor is the fifth Beatle. I find that very, very interesting. I've heard over the years that some people say that Brian Epstein was the fifth Beatle, George Martin is the fifth Beatle, and to a lesser extent, perhaps, Pete Best was the fifth Beatle. Why do you think Derek Taylor is the fifth Beatle?
Well, you've got to give me a little bit of journalistic license with that. I mean, it may be a slight tad of exaggeration, but I want to tell you that for me, on that tour, Derek Taylor was the man, the go-to man. I didn't go to Brian because Brian was aloof. Brian was off to the side, indicated he didn't want to talk to the media. Derek was my go-between.
Well, he was the press officer.
Yeah, he was the press officer. He was Brian's personal assistant and the press officer, and he made things happen. And also he had an incredible sharp wit and mind. His Liverpudlian humor was exactly on alignment with the Beatles. They were interchangeable. Oh. And the other incredible thing was that, Derek didn't have a Scouse accent. He had more of an educated British officer's accent, believe it or not.
Even though he was from the Pool.
Yes, even though he came from Scouse territory.
Right.
But Derek was the guy that the Beatles admired and paid attention to. And if Derek said, I need you to talk to Ivor, or I need you to talk to one of the DJs, the Beatles obeyed. Well, it's very hard to please all masters. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of masters to please on that first American tour, clamoring television, radio, and media and print media. And Derek was actually the concert master. He was brilliant at that, and as I say, witty, and he helped make it happen for me, particularly because he actually used to work for my old newspaper, the Daily Express, and so Derek was key to making that 64 tour success for me and also for the Beatles. He did a fantastic PR job handling the press conferences, although if I may add, the press conferences were entertainment. The press conferences were the same old questions that the Beatles came up with, not the same old answers. Mm-hmm. They were like the Marx Brothers on speed. They started an answer, another one finished it. That was the way, how in alignment they all were. And it was a miracle to behold, because believe me, I saw 25 press conferences, but they were all entertainment.
That's good. Well, they figured, you know what, we might as well have fun.
Exactly.
If we have to do
well,
this.
Well, they did.
Bit.
They knew it. They knew it. They thought if they sat there going, and I spent my lifetime interviewing celebrities, covering Hollywood, and I want to tell you, to do that again and again and again is tough, but they said, we're going to have fun. We're not going to grunt. We're not going to give a no, yes answer. I mean, you've had interviews where people have grunted and given no, yes answers, haven't you?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Doesn't work.
When did Derek join the Beatles? Brian hired Derek when, in 62 or 63?
In 1963.
He hired Derek?
Yes. Derek had written a brilliant review of the Beatles, and Brian his friends said, hey, that's a great piece that Derek Taylor has written in the Daily Express about you. It's one of the best that's ever been written about you, Brian. And Brian got Derek together. They hit it off, and he offered him a job working for him and then as a press officer. And in between that, Brian said, I'm going to write my memoir called A Cellar Full of Noise. I'm not a writer. Derek, I'll talk to you. You write it for me. And indeed, that's what happened. Derek ghosted Brian Epstein's first book, A Cellar Full of Noise.
Oh, Derek wrote that.
Derek wrote it, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now,
And they hit it off, and they were on the same wavelength. Although I must add that Brian was very tempestuous very often for a variety of reasons. And Derek and he got into a lot of fights.
Oh, did they?
Oh, a lot of rows. And right on the last day of the American tour, Derek said to me, I've just resigned. I've just had an argument with Brian, a silly argument. Brian accused Derek of taking his limousine.
Oh, I know that story.
This is in 64 at the Paramount Studio. Paramount
Theater in New York City.
Exactly. Charity show.
$100 a ticket.
They all came back to the hotel, and somehow Brian got stranded because after the concert, we all came back to the hotel, and Derek, maybe he took the limo, who knows? But Brian came back, foaming at the mouth, screamed at Derek. Derek screamed back at him, and that night, Derek said to me, I've just stuck a resignation letter under Brian's room door, and I'm no longer with the Beatles.
But Brian did not accept it, did he?
No, he didn't. When they flew back on the plane, Derek said he was in tourist, and Brian relented and said, come up, we'll open some champagne. On the way back to England, and they hit it off again. But then Derek did leave and came to Hollywood and became a PR guy for a multitude of great talents.
So you're saying he wrote the letter of resignation in 64, shoved it under Brian's door.
Yes.
Brian rejected it, didn't accept it.
Right.
And Derek left anyway?
Yes.
Oh, in 64 he left?
Yeah, he left in the late 64, yeah.
Okay.
He left. And then, of course, what happened was strangely enough, he kept a good relationship with Brian, despite the fights and the arguments. Mm-hmm. And when he was in LA, the liaison continued because when Brian had a big party, I think Brian had bought a big house outside London and had a big party, and he sent tickets to Derek and Joan, Derek's wife Joan and Derek, and they flew over, and Derek said to me, I'm leaving, I think it was 67, Derek said, I'm leaving to go to Brian's party because he'd sent us tickets. So it was a love-hate relationship. I mean, a very emotional relationship. And then, of course, as you know, Derek eventually left L.A., moved back into Apple, and worked for the Beatles.
That's right. It's interesting that he went back. Of course, Brian had passed away.
Yes.
By that time.
Yeah, Brian passed away in 1967. Yeah.
August 67. Yes. Yeah, that was a very, very sad day. Now, here's a very strange thing that I have noticed many times throughout the years. I guess my ears are pretty sharp. I listen very carefully to music, to lyrics. And at the end of Baby, You're a Rich Man, I used to say to my friends, hey, listen to what the Beatles did. They mixed in, there's another voice in there, and they're saying something other than, baby, you're a rich man too. And they're saying, oh, Brooke, what are you talking about? I said, I'm hearing, baby, you're a rich fag Jew. At the very end on the fade out, they're going, oh, no. I said, well, I really do. I think so. So I'm reading your book and I'm going, my God, there's that story that I've been talking about all those years. So I guess that's true then.
Well, that is true because John and Brian had this kind of volatile emotional relationship. And John was a provocateur enormous. And he loved to provoke everybody. And he loved to needle Brian. And he needled Brian, first of all, because he was gay. And in those days, being gay was a bit dodgy because you could get arrested. In his earlier career, Brian did get arrested and had that memory scarred on his brain, and it was a horrible experience. And yet, John was close enough to Brian when he could. I mean, you can with your friends, you can, we used to say, take the piss out of him. And John loved to take the piss out of people. Mm-hmm. That was how he got his kicks. Mm-hmm. And he would sing that. And of course, George Martin would say, John!
You can't do that.
Yes, in his edificated voice, Sir George now. But John did it. Don't forget, John, at some of the recording sessions, believe it or not, had imbibed a few chemicals to...
Oh, just a few.
Just a few. And so he got away with it, and indeed, your ears were correct.
Well, thank you for saying that, Ivor. I'm glad to know that my ears are working properly.
Indeed.
There's the story about the Beatles and Bob Dylan. And for years, the story goes that it was in 1964, late August perhaps, at the Delmonico Hotel, that Dylan meets the Beatles for the first time, and Dylan turns the Beatles on to marijuana for the first time. I've heard stories that the Beatles actually had experienced marijuana prior to that, and it wasn't the first time. Then, in reading your book, I'm finding out that this whole thing about the meeting and smoking marijuana with Bob Dylan did not take place at the Delmonico Hotel. It took place somewhere else. Please tell our listeners the real story, Ivor.
Well, here's the story, and you know, I have read what you've just said, Delmonico Hotel, with the guy from the Saturday Evening Post and the manager of Bob Dylan. But I want to tell you, from my memory, I vividly remember it was the last day, we'd gone to this kind of not seedy hotel outside Kennedy Airport, which used to be called Idlewild Airport. It was called the Idlewild Motor Inn. And it was all over. We'd finished it. Everybody was celebrating. Derek was there trying to do, believe it or not, at the last minute interviews with DJs with the Beatles. And I am in the hotel, and I tell you this scruffy looking geezer wearing a backpack and a pencil moustache who looked like he would rob your hen house showed up, and I said, I saw him in the hallway, and I said, that is Mr. Dylan. And indeed, it was Mr. Dylan, because he went into the mini suite that they had. They put down the towels, and then anybody who knows the procedure knows you need wet towels to stop people in other rooms from fainting with fumes, noxious fumes from the inside room. And Bob Dylan produced there and then the fat marijuana cigarette, which he gave to Ringo. And Ringo, not knowing the protocol, smoked the whole
bloody thing like a cigarette himself. He kept it to himself.
He did.
And he must have got whacked.
He was not only whacked, he was on his knees giggling like a child. And fortunately, Mr. Dylan brought along additional...
ample supply.
Ample supply, that's the word, yeah. Ample supply was provided by Mr. Dylan, and Brian got potted out of his mind. They all got potted. They tried to write things down. I mean, I'm not a great imbiber of marijuana, but I know when I did have a marijuana cookie once, I couldn't finish a sentence. It affects people differently. Mm-hmm. But that was what happened. That was what I saw, not at the Delmonico, but at the last night. And thinking back, the Delmonico, they may have tried something, but I want to tell you, there were dozens of cops there. It was in the middle of the tour. I don't see it happening. And the guy that told about it was a Saturday Evening Post guy who many years later told about the story. And to be honest with you, I think his memory is flawed because he ended up being pretty much of an acid head himself, a great writer. By the time he got round to writing about it, I believe, and I read and I heard that his mind was somewhat addled. Mm-hmm. So he decided, and he became the expert. He was the one that said it was at the New York hotel.
At the Delmonico.
At the Delmonico.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it right here. We got the story clear finally with Ivor Davis. You heard it right here on Come Together with the Beatles. Thank you, Ivor, for setting it straight after all these years.
Pleasure.
Were you in the room with the Beatles and Bob Dylan when they were smoking pot, or were you outside?
I was outside. We were outside. Doors were open until they closed the doors and but by that time they had begun to sample Dylan's wares.
So you could smell it?
Yeah, I could smell it hugely, even though they put wet towels down.
Yeah.
I guess, I don't think the Beatles knew to do that, but whoever realized that they better do that, because I think you could get arrested.
Back then,
and it was severe. I remember, this has nothing to do with the Beatles, but I remember Dame Margot Fonteyn, the great ballerina,
yes, told
me that she got arrested in San Francisco. She was at a party where they were smoking pot. The police raided the party. Dame Margot, Rudolph Nureyev, and the rest fled to the rooftop in the San Francisco hotel, where the cops found them and arrested them. So smoking pot was life without possibility of parole.
Well, I'm sure perhaps Brian had something to do with the damp towel, knowing Brian.
Yes.
I am so happy that you joined us today on Come Together with the Beatles. Did you want to say one more thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it is not Ivan the Terrible Davis.
Oh, no, it's Ivor the Wonderful Davis.
Thank you. There's a delight to be on the show with you, Brooke. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Ivor.